that change in 1977, or put the actual date that that change really began in 1977, but I'm going to go back a little bit even before that. What happened in 1977? For the first time, the political right took over in Israel. Menachem Begin won the elections, defeated Shimon Peres, and really for the first time, the founding generation of Israelis, those who, not the Sephardim who had been in Israel for hundreds of years, not the first wave of Aliyah, the first wave of immigrants who came in the 1880s and established places that many of you probably have relatives or lived in, Petah Tikva and Rehovot and Rishon LeZion. Not the first Aliyah wave, but the second wave of immigration, which began in 1904 and ended, unfortunately, with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. And they, the Chalutzim, the pioneers, who established three things really. They established the kibbutz, and we all think of the kibbutz. Out of the kibbutz, 11 years later grew the moshav, a little bit less collective, but agricultural. But in 1909, this wave of immigrants founded something else, totally different than the socialist paradigm of the kibbutz, and that was a little modest city. I was just talking with Yemima about her birthplace, Tel Aviv. Most people think that, well, the Chalutzim founded, they did, Tel Aviv, but also it was that same generation of people in the exact same year who founded the first Hebrew city. So not everybody who came in the early part of the 20th century was socialist. And I think that's something to remember. Those immigrants who came tried to create a new Jew. Someone who was not an exilic Jew, someone who was weak. Think of the famous poem by Chaim Nachman Bialik in 1903, City of Slaughter, where he laments the Jews of Kishinev. He criticizes not the Cossacks who have killed and raped and burnt, but he criticizes the Jews. The Jews, who as he refers to as the descendants of the Maccabees, are mere weaklings. And the question that the Jews of Kishinev asked their rabbis after the pogrom was having to do with the nature of their relations with their wives. After their wives had been raped by the Cossacks, were they able to have relations with them? And this really set Chernikovsky, this really set Chaim Nachman Bialik in 1903 on his poem, critical of the exilic Jew. And so 1904 comes along, and the Chalutzim who come to the land of Israel want to create a new Jew. And the new Jew is someone who is based on no longer being the, no longer being based on the, being the subject of someone else's history, but rather the object, I knew I was confused, no longer being the object of someone else's history, but the subject of our own story. And to do so, they had to create a new person based on three pillars. Manual labor as an act of redemption in and of itself, the idea of not doing what society around us forced us, what professions they forced us into, but doing everything in society. Independent labor. 2, self-defense. The notion already of the need to protect ourselves in the land of Israel began early in the 20th century. What eventually became Tzahal, the Israel Defense Forces, grew out of something called the Haganah, which grew out of something called HaShomer, already over 100 years ago. And the third, Hebrew language and Hebrew culture. And so anybody who came to this new land of Israel had to kind of go through this transmorphosis of being no longer an exilic Jew, but rather someone who was free and independent, and really created a brand new persona. Going out in the fields, working from before the sun rose until after the sun set, that was an act of redemption. And for those native Israelis in the crowd, you remember the song that you grew up in. I'm going to give the first 2 lines, and the rest of you are going to fill it in. Anu banu arza, livnot ulehibanot ba. We come to the land of Israel to build, literally to build, and I'm looking at all these beautiful pictures of Jaffa and Gedi, I guess, and Tiberias over there, or Eilat. We've come to the land to build, physically to build the land, but to be built in the process. It was an act of redemption, the actual physical labor. And so the pioneers in 1904 and 1914 wanted everybody after them to be just like them. Now, how did they do that? Well, new sons and daughters were born in the land of Israel, and they created a series of myths, foundational stories around which their children would be socialized. A number of books have been written about this, but I'm going to focus tonight on basically one major book. Some of you might have read it, by Yael Zerubbabel, which is already almost 20 years old, but I'll get into that in just a moment. But have any of you read the book by Noach, what's his last name?
Harari.
Thank you, Noach Harari. Came out about 6-7 years ago in Hebrew, about 5 years ago in English. It's called Sapiens. Best-selling book is like 45 languages. If I could write a book like that, then, well, yeah. But it's an amazing book, and he talks about the transition in man, beginning to form into societies largely around their ability to create stories, fictions, and myths. I'm going to quote a little bit from his book. If you haven't read it, I strongly suggest reading it. And he tries to understand how Homo sapiens, in contrast to other animals, were able to organize in society. And he says, because we can believe in common myths. And when I say myth, I mean a story that might or might not have happened, whose significance is greater than the story itself. So we can think of the classic Greek myths. Does Icarus actually fly close to the sun? Does Andromeda, as I look out at the rocks of Andromeda on the left over there in Jaffa, does she actually tie down, and does Perseus, her lover, rescue her? Stories around, does Narcissus really fall in love with himself and die because he doesn't eat and he doesn't drink as he sees this image of this beautiful, this ideal representation of beauty? So these are stories that might or might not have happened. And he talks about how myths can change. So the example that Harari gives is the story of France, a society that was organized until 1789 around a myth that God made kings and queens. But what happens? And one day on the 14th of July, 1789, society organizes around a new myth, which replaces the old myth, which says...
Off with your head.
It says what?
Off with your head.
Well, it says off with your head. It says liberty, equality, fraternity. And it says that no longer is the monarch in charge, but the people are sovereign, because humanity is sovereign. And that myth replaces the myth of the Ancien regime that is based essentially on God choosing who the monarchs are going to be. And it just happened very, very quickly. And that, I think, is what's happened in Israeli society. So Zerubbabel, in her book, Recovered Roots, Collective Memory and the Making of National Israel, describes three central myths around which young Israelis are socialized in the first generation. Myth number one, the story of Masada. Anybody in the room not yet? Dan, this is for you.
This is for my son.
Anybody not? No, I don't mean the dessert. No. I mean, the question is, how many of you have yet to be in Israel? That's why I'm asking the rabbis. Have yet to be in Israel?
We have a trip
many
summer
of you?
2021.
It was worth me coming. See? And exactly. So for those who have not yet been in Israel, she takes three central stories. The first one is the story of Masada. The second one is the story of the Bar Kokhba revolt, and the third one is the story of Tel Chai. And she talks about how what the Zionist movement, this foundational generation of people who came barely a little over 100 years ago, created a new persona by not only engaging in physical labor, not only speaking a new language that isn't an exilic language, not only by defending the country, but also by sharing stories, which might have been true, but might not have been true as well. Different stories than the stories that Jews were raised on outside of the country. The first Tel Chai, 1920, a community close to the border of Lebanon. That's actually where my middle daughter, Adi, is studying her degree in education as we speak. Not as we speak, because it's Shabbat and it's 6 in the morning in Israel, but she's preparing for exams, so she might actually be still awake studying. But Tel Chai was a little community founded a few years before 1920. And on the 1st of March 1920, there was a fight. 8 of the defenders of that community were killed. It was just after the First World War. For 4 centuries, the area had been under control of the Ottoman Empire. And as the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist, Britain and France came in and were in the process of dividing up the land and the areas of influence between them. And in that context, an Arab force came and attacked this Jewish community. There were 4 Jewish towns in that part of the country. And 8 of the defenders were killed. And one of the defenders, allegedly, he was one of the defenders, Joseph Trumpeldor, allegedly said, as he was on his deathbed, it's good to die for one's country. Tov lamut. But now, I'm glad there are a handful of Israelis here because they can justify exactly what I'm saying. The fact that the native Israelis in this room are able to recite verbatim the central stories around which they were socialized is proof, at least the first part of what I'm talking about. So here's the story, which she describes as a ethos of pioneering, an ethos of heroism and of self-defense. Think about it. Working the land, an agricultural settlement, speaking a new language, even saying, and the reason that some people believe he might not have actually said that is that he didn't really speak Hebrew well enough to actually coin a phrase that 100 years later has become an important part of the land. So there's a cemetery up there every year on the 1st of Adar, the Hebrew calendar date of the falling of the community. There is a ceremony honoring Yosef Trumpeldor and the other 7. But Zerubbabel says that, quote, Tel Chai emerged as a myth of origins to fulfill the classic role of a new national myth for young people in the process of defining its historical mission. It's about the experience of settlement and defense, work and sacrifice, departure from exile, and movement toward national revival. So it's amazing because already in the land of Israel, 15 years after the second wave of immigration comes, we have a foundational story of something happened to us. Right? Do you defend that piece of the country? It's far away. Do you abandon that piece of the country and bring the few dozen people who are there back to the central part of the country and not there? Already is an understanding of collective responsibility and the notion of it's good to die for a cause that is bigger than me, but is about the we. The second is Masada. Jumping over 20 years, Masada, the story, for those who aren't familiar, the last stand of free Jews in Judah against the Romans 2,000 years ago. 967 men, women, and children take their own 960 of 967 to be precise, take their own lives rather than surrender to the Romans. Now, you all probably know the story of Masada. You might have seen the 1980 movie with Peter O'Toole. You might have read the book. It's better to see the movie than to read the book because the book's quite thick and is a little bit graphic. But 1980 is the story of the movie. But already in the 1920s and 1930s, Masada has been identified as the last stand of Jews in the land of Israel under Rome. And what happens in 1942, where Israel is not yet a country, but what's happening not too far away in Europe in 1942, by the way?
World War II.
Oh, yes. World War II, the Holocaust. Jews are being murdered. And in 1942, there's a growth in Jewish community in Palestine, right? Jews have started to come from Poland in the 20s, and they've come from Germany in the 1930s. And all of a sudden, the story of Masada begins to gain a more popular telling, not really in 1942, but already in the late 1930s. Youth groups, Jewish underground organizations like the Palmach, go on long marches to the desert. They climb up on top of Masada, and then they recite the poem written by a Zionist poet decades before in the 1920s. And I'm going to say this again to prove my thesis. Shenit.
Shenit Masada lo tipol.
Yeah, I have a grouping of Shenit Masada lo tipol. Masada will not fall again. The idea, of course, was that if we can create a bond between the young Jews who've come from all over the world, the land of Israel, and our story of what happened here 2 millennia ago, right above that hill, above your, no, it's actually that one, the last one over there, that is Masada. It's a perfect example. You see, Rabbi, it's not even the myths in the land of Israel, it's even the Jewish communities outside of the land of Israel. In fact, I just got an email from a friend who wants to come to Israel next year and wants to have their child's bar mitzvah at Masada. Now, I'm going to discourage them from having it at Masada, but that's another story. Tzipori is a good place. At any rate, what happens? They take their lives. 1920s, this poem is written. 1930s, early 1940s. And then in 1942, an amazing phenomenon happens. A young man named Shmaryahu Gutman, who's involved in the Palmach, and who eventually becomes an archaeologist, leading one of the leaders, the kind of the founding generation of archaeology. And archaeology, pre-state and in the early years after Israeli independence, becomes a tool for socialization as well. We were just talking, the rabbi and I, about your assistant rabbi, your associate rabbi, whose husband is an archaeologist, Carrie's husband.
He's a Talmud scholar, but archaeology on the side.
Close enough. But if you want to really get close to Talmud, the best way of doing it is not sitting and doing a daf yomi, but is actually to excavate an archaeological site in the land of Israel. We all know that.
Yeah.
At any rate, archaeology becomes a means of socialization. What better way? You do it, you engage in physical labor, right? You go out there and you uncover your ancient roots. And so Masada becomes a central part of the socialization really in January, February of 1942 under the tutelage of a guy named Shmaryahu Gutman. And in the famous book written in 2013, which even more of you have read than Mr. Harari's book, called My Promised Land by Ari Shavit, he dedicates an entire chapter to the story of Masada. And at the end of the chapter he says, following, Gutman, quote, wants to unify the youth, the Hebrew youth, around the powerful concrete symbol, which he recognizes in Masada. Masada will become the new locus of Israeli identity. The Hebrew past gives a sense of meaning to the Hebrew presence to face the Hebrew future. He uses Masada to unite and to inspire young Zionists. So, story number 2, we've got to defend ourselves, we've got to be strong to make sure we're never in a situation as we were 2,000 years ago, surrounded by enemies that we had no choice but to take our lives. Myth number 3 is the myth of the Bar Kokhba revolt. How many people have heard of the Bar Kokhba revolt? That's good. That's more than 50%. That's unusual for most Jewish communities. Bar Kokhba revolt, 60 years after the Second Temple is destroyed, the Roman Emperor Hadrian issues a series of anti-Jewish policies. The Jewish leadership in the land of Israel thinks that this is bad news. It seems that the Mashiach, the Messiah, is just around the corner. And Rabbi Akiva appoints or anoints a man, Shimon Bar Kokhba, to be claims he is the Mashiach. There's nothing worse than this. The end is near. We're going to fight to the bitter end. It was a bad revolt. Almost 500,000 Jews were killed, according to the Roman historians. And Bar Kokhba dies in a place called Beitar, the last stand. And essentially what happens is archaeology tries to figure out exactly where Beitar is, and tries to find those roots 60 years after Masada of where the great heroes of the Bar Kokhba revolt were, and to try to find some sort of connection to them. But the amazing thing about the Bar Kokhba revolt is fewer people have heard about the Bar Kokhba revolt than Masada. But Beitar becomes a symbol through a youth movement, which is named Beitar, which is actually two acronyms. It's either Beit Yosef Trumpeldor, which is in memory of Joseph Trumpeldor, myth number one, it's good to die for your country, Tel Chai 1920, and two, Beitar, the last stand of the Bar Kokhba revolt. My wife Michelle, what's that?
Trumpeldor is with a tet.
But it sounds good. My wife actually, Michelle, who didn't grow up where I grew up here and didn't go to Camp Miriam, she went to Beitar, the youth movement, and there was a very deep connection in her Beitar to the story of the Bar Kokhba revolt. I'm going to add one other myth, and that is to Zerubbabel's list in her book, because she already goes back about 25 years, and that is the myth of Hanukkah. Myth of Hanukkah. Kids, what's your favorite holiday? No pressure. Is your father a rabbi? What's your favorite holiday?
Hanukkah.
Yeah, Hanukkah. Why Hanukkah?
Because they're presents.
Because they're presents. Perfect example. The most senior people recognize the language of the original myth, the foundational myth of Israeli society. The youngest are helping me out as well. Good. Hanukkah. It's not because of Adam Sandler, right? Good. Hanukkah. Now, what's the miracle of Hanukkah? 50 Jews, you tell me. What's the miracle of Hanukkah?
The oil lasted 7 days. Longer than it was supposed to.
Your dad's a rabbi. The oil lasted for how long, Judah?
It lasted for 7 days longer than it was supposed to.
Good. You didn't finish the sentence. Good. It lasted for altogether
8 days.
8 days, and that's why what do we light in our homes? A
Hanukkah.
Chanukiah, not a menorah. Fantastic. Now, the Talmud talks about, and if you don't study enough Talmud, come with Professor to study, to do a dig in archaeology in Israel. But the Talmud raises a question. And that question is, what is Hanukkah? And there are actually two answers to Hanukkah. There's the answer that we all know, and that is this miracle of the Maccabees, led by, what was the older brother's name? Do you remember, Judah? Judah, exactly. Led by Judah. And they come to Jerusalem, and they discover there's a little bit of oil, as Judah says. It's not fair because it's your story, right? And the oil ends up lasting for 8 days. But there's another story of Hanukkah, and the rabbis didn't really talk about it. It's a story of a revolt by Jews against Jews. Now, most people will say it's a revolt of Jews against the Hellenizers, the Greek civilization. But in reality, it was more of a revolt against the Jews who were becoming not integrated, but assimilated into Greek Hellenistic culture, and were prepared to carry out pagan sacrificial rituals. And so the rabbis didn't talk about that aspect of Hanukkah. It was there in the Talmud, but it was, only ththose who study the Daf Yomi actually have access to that. I mean, today it's easier on Safari online. But the bottom line was, here was the story, that we celebrated for almost 2,000 years, an amazing festival, post-biblical festival, where the real story was kind of pushed away because this amazing miracle that Judah talks about of the oil lasting for 8 days. We didn't play up. Why not? Because we're a subjugated minority. And the last thing you want to do is to celebrate a heroic stand of 967 Jews against 10,000 Roman soldiers at the end of the Great Revolt around Masada. The last thing you want to do is celebrate the fact that Hadrian is seen. If you've been to England, you've seen Hadrian's Wall, a great hero, a great European, great Roman civilizer, the first Roman emperor to have a beard. I mean, he's, in museums all over the world, an important guy. But from a Jewish context, he was not very friendly to us. And we didn't celebrate that revolt because we were worried. If you were a subjugated minority, the last thing you want to do is to celebrate these great events which chronicle your ancestors' audacity/chutzpah to stand up to the majority culture. But all of a sudden with Zionism, what happens? Late 19th century. The idea of Max Nordau, one of a close friend and associate of Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, starts using a terminology of the muscular Jew. How can a Jew be muscular if he's not allowed into the fitness clubs, the golf clubs? Sorry, that's a sensitive issue, still in North America. But if he's not allowed to work out in the gyms with everybody else, how can he be muscular? But 1903, we talked already about Chaim Nachman Bialik, speaking about the idea of having strong Jews who would be strong like the Maccabees. And of course, there is a Jewish Olympic that begins in the 1930s called the Maccabiah. Now think about it. What were the Maccabees fighting against? Jews who were too Hellenized, too assimilated into larger society. And it's, cover your ears, please. I mean, the book of Maccabees, which is not part of our biblical canon, but is part at least of the Catholic biblical canon, describes at great length how Jews can be more like non-Jews. Talk to your dad and mom about this afterwards, but they actually tried to uncircumcise themselves. Now, not surgically, but use weights, but don't try that, I shouldn't have said. Anyway, but the point is that Jews were so prepared to give up on their Judaism, and we didn't talk about that, right? We talked about this miracle, but the reality is all of a sudden in the late 19th, early 20th century, the story of the Maccabees becomes a story of heroism of few standing up, even within house, right? Even within the Jewish community, against the larger culture. And so I'll add the story of the transition, I think, of Hanukkah and the story of the Maccabiah and the Maccabi sports movement. The best sports teams in Israel are Maccabi, very much against what the Maccabees were actually standing for 2,100 years ago. So we got 3 myths of Zerubbabel, which I agree with, and a 4th one that I've added, Hanukkah, Tel Chai 1920. Right, so you've got 1 from the modern era, Tel Chai, it's good to die for your country. 2, the Masada fall in 73 of the Common Era, the Bar Kokhba revolt 135, and finally the story of the Maccabees back in the early 21st century. Now, these were stories around which every single Jew who came to Israel after 1948, coming from where, by the way, either Holocaust survivors from Europe or Sephardic Mizrahi Jews coming from all across the Middle East, from Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria and Egypt and Libya and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Iran and Yemen. And they came to Israel and they were socialized in the image that the founding generation who came pre-1948 wanted to socialize them in. But what happens? All of a sudden 1967 comes along. And 1967, Israel comes from being the small little David to being this very large Goliath. In 6 days, we defeat 3 Arab countries. And all of a sudden, it's this question of, if we've been a people denied power for 2,000 years, been given power today, how do we wield that power? And in many ways, Israeli society was divided from 1967 around that central question of a powerless people with lots of power and lots of land and minorities amongst us who don't necessarily want to be under control. And the political left suggested, give up land for negotiations and for peace with the neighbors. The political right said, why should we give up any land? It's our land, God gave it to us. It's right there in the book of Genesis. And things began to change post-1967 around that question. Early 1970s, things began to change again because of 2 major events. The first happened in Munich in 1972. What happened in Munich? The 11 Israeli athletes were murdered in Munich. Now, these were weightlifters. These were athletes who were good enough to make it to the Olympics. And some of you remember, either back then in 1972, because it was shown live on, was it ABC Sport? And some of you remember because you saw the Spielberg movie a few years ago. What was the position in which these strong, brave Israeli athletes were killed? They were not killed as the terrorists came into their rooms. They were killed with their arms behind their back, waiting in the helicopters for the Germans to come and for the negotiations to succeed so they would be freed. And a year later, in October of 1973, a horrible trauma in Israeli society, where Egypt and Syria invaded Israel, and close to 3,000 men were killed in just a few weeks of the Yom Kippur War. And many of those people who were wounded and taken into captivity raised a white flag. They didn't do what the people did at Masada in 1900 years beforehand. They went into captivity. Many were tortured, many suffered. Only now we're discovering what PTSD is, almost 50 years later. But all of a sudden Israel began to say, wait a minute. This whole notion of this collective, it's good to die for your country, people began to revisit it. And already in the early 80s, I think, there began to be a change in terms of how people looked at Masada in particular as a place that people visited, a place that told a story of suicide rather than a place of heroism. Maybe heroism was a place where the rabbis who negotiated with the Romans while the temple was being destroyed and figured out a new path to Judaism maybe those people are more heroic than those people who fought to the bitter end, because historically, if we look at the story of Masada, and we look at the story of Bar Kokhba, and maybe even a little bit of the Maccabees, but more the first two, it's pretty clear that they could have done a lot better, perhaps had they have negotiated with the enemy, than if they fought to the end. And Israelis began to ask themselves, but if it's good to die for your country, and we're all dead, then there's not a country. Or if it's better to take our lives and to die freely than to be slaves to the Romans, but wait a minute, why are we having this conversation in Hebrew on top of Masada 1900 years later, if the last of the Jews in Judea took their lives 2,000 years ago? So people began to revisit these things. Rabin, I think, as Commander-in-Chief, Yitzhak Rabin, in 1967, and later on as Prime Minister from 1974 to 1977, he, I think, really was the persona of this Sabra, the first Israeli Prime Minister to say born in the land of Israel, who was this new Jew who studied agriculture and spent his life in the military and, of course, spoke in Hebrew. But Rabin lost he didn't lose, actually. Peres lost the elections in 77, but the political right took over in 1977 in the context of this kind of move, I think, away from the collective myths. And in the past 20 to 25 years, I think it's fair to say that Israeli society is moving a lot further away from the collective myths. And I'll give a handful of examples. I talked about the food already in the service, but I also want to talk about museums. Because the museums that have been redone, or the museums that have been opened in the past 20 years, tell a very different story from a very different perspective. The original museums, Yad Vashem, for example, the Holocaust Museum, did not mention a specific name in the museum of any of the victims. Whereas the new museum that opened in 2005 tells the story predominantly from the perspective of individual stories. It's a huge transition, which essentially says, my take at least, is that in the early years, your individuality was secondary to the collective spirit. And it's gone through huge changes. So that's one museum. Two, Yad Li'Yeler, I know some of you visited the Children's Memorial at Kibbutz Lachamei Gedod. Already in the mid-1990s, they opened up. They had a special exhibit that is targeted to the children and again mentions the name of the children. The Palmach Museum, how many visited the Palmach Museum? Opened 20 years ago. The Palmach Museum takes 12 young men and young women, historically fictitious characters, and it goes through their life to understand, what's that?
Hobby Museum.
I'll get there in a sec. And to understand the period, right? It wasn't about the re'ut, about the friendship and the camaraderie. It was about the individual stories, the Shmulek and the Sarla and the Rivka and the Yisrael. You need to understand who they are as individuals in order to understand the big collective picture. The Rabin Museum, after Rabin was murdered, the government voted to fund a memorial museum which tells the story of the Prime Minister, the murdered Prime Minister, and it tells the story of Israeli society. To understand Israeli society, let's look at one individual. Yes, he was the Prime Minister, Commander-in-Chief, and many other roles, but let's look at him to try to understand the much larger picture. The Menachem Begin Museum, that also opened about just at the 15th anniversary. Understand Menachem Begin, right? If you got Rabin on the left, you got to have Begin on the right-hand side. Understand his own personal story, growing up in what we call the former Soviet Union. It wasn't yet the Soviet Union, but growing up in Eastern Europe, his story, his life experience. Understand him, his dilemmas, his challenges, his successes, his failures, and then you can understand the larger picture. Beit HaTfutzot, the last museum. Any of you have been to Beit HaTfutzot? It was called, in English, I say was, the Diaspora Museum. What is diaspora? It's from the Greek word dispersion. Now, if I were to say to you, nice, pleasantly satiated because the dinner was good, Jews in Vancouver tonight, that you should all be a dispersed people, you probably would not be too happy by that, but we've been dispersed many, 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 many times. 1978, the museum opens in Tel Aviv, on the campus of Tel Aviv University, and the ideological mentor of that museum is a guy named Abba Kovner. Abba Kovner grew up in Vilnius, was one of the leaders of the Vilna Ghetto Uprising, and Abba Kovner is the one who famously said in New Year's Eve 1941 that we will not go like sheep to the slaughter. When he inspired youth in Vilna and many other places across Europe to fight against the Nazis, we've all been given a death sentence, he said. How he understood this, he himself couldn't understand 20 years later. But we've all been given a death sentence, we are going to go down fighting. He survives miraculously, and he founds the Diaspora Museum, and its purpose was to try to understand what it was that we brought with us when we came to the land of Israel, Holocaust survivors, poor Jews. Well, we weren't poor when we left Morocco or we left Iraq, but we weren't allowed to take anything with us. So by the time we came to Israel, we were poor Jews. What was it that we brought with us in our rucksack and our suitcase to create the state? And the museum, for those who remember, tells a very, very interesting narrative that essentially begins with the destruction of the temple, a replica of the stones that Titus and his soldiers threw down on the 9th of Av 70, and ends as you ascend, literally in Hebrew, la'alot, as you go up, as one ascends to the land of Israel when you make aliyah, and ends through a Chanukiah, it's actually a menorah. A menorah, and the image of the end of the museum is that wherever Jews were, over thousands of years of exile and dispersion, all that they dreamed about was coming back to the land of Israel. And essentially the museum is a Zionist narrative which puts an end or a death knell to diaspora. There was nothing interesting and nothing exciting that happened in 2,000 years of exile. The only thing of value and credibility to 1,900 years of Jewish life was the longing to return to the land of Israel. And thus the museum, I'd say, thrived for the first few years because everybody was so amazing. 1978, great new technology. Unfortunately, by 2018, it hadn't changed at all, and it needed to change. And now it's still called in Hebrew, Beit HaTfutzot. But in English, it's called the Museum of the Jewish People. Now, the Museum of the Jewish People is a seemingly very different institution than the Diaspora Museum. Forget if you've ever seen it or you can understand what's inside it, but conceptually, it's very different. And for those of you who have been there, you remember in the old museum, it hasn't opened yet, but you remember in the old museum there was a spine that went right through the center, and you kind of walked up the 3 stories of the museum to see it, and it was a spine of memory, and all these traumatic events in this Megillat Ha'esh. There was a book down there, and all the traumatic events, the Holocaust and the Chmielnitsky pogroms, and this event, and all these horrible events that happened to the Jewish people, as if to suggest that the spine that kept our people together for 1,900 years of exile and dispersion was the horrible memory of all the destruction that had befallen our people. Today it's got a totally different, it's not fully open yet, but when it opens it'll be a totally different book. 2 other things before I open up to questions, and that is, how many of you remember reading a book almost 50 years ago by Amos Elon, Israelis, Fathers and Sons? It's a generational thing. Okay, not that many of them. How many of you remember reading a book called The Israelis by Donna Rosenthal? Came out about 15 years ago. So in 1971, Amos Elon writes a book, Israelis, Founders and Sons. And he talks about the group of Chalutzim, the pioneers, who founded the kibbutzim, the moshavim, who founded Tel Aviv, and socialized this brand new Jew, not somebody based on the exile, but somebody built on, based on building up this new society. And it was about founders and sons without real specifics. It was about the collective ethos of Israeli society. 30 plus years, almost 35 years later, Donna Rosenthal writes a book called The Israelis. And in her book, each chapter is dedicated to a different subgroup within Israeli society. The Druze member of Knesset, the Arab woman, the Bedouin Arab woman who was the first Arab Bedouin who studies in university, an LGBT man and his lifestyle, an Orthodox community, an immigrant from Ethiopia. And all of a sudden, if you were to take those 2 books to try to understand, and it's the same title, the subtitle is different, right? The Israelis, Founders and Sons. The Israelis, I think she calls it what she call it? I think it's a biography of, I remember, it's called, Ordinary People in an Extraordinary Land. So you get an understanding of how he talks about everyone wants to be the same, or the founding generation wants everybody the same, but she talks about, as she says, one nation, many tribes. So we're a group of people, but we're not all the same. We're not homogenized. And there are a couple other examples besides the food, and with this, and if we have time, I'll be happy to take some questions. And that is the difference between the 2 ways of immigration from Ethiopia. Many of you, I'm sure, were involved in 1984, Operation Moses, 1991, Operation Solomon. One big difference was that when the immigrants came over, they were all forced in 1984 to be just like Ari Ben Canaan. That is Paul Newman, of course, in the movie Exodus. Hebraicize your name. Be like everybody else. Don't give us these crazy, unpronounceable names in Amharic. No. And don't speak your native language. Right? As many of you who made Aliyah years and years ago were encouraged or forced essentially to speak only Hebrew. Don't preserve your culture from the land that you came from. And by 1991, Israeli society realized that we can't do that. If we want the 130, 140,000 Jews in Ethiopia to be an active and a proud member of Israeli society, we have to encourage them to preserve their tradition, one of which is their language. How can you have somebody who is illiterate in his or her language in Ethiopia come to a new society and try to learn Hebrew and then won't be able to communicate with their grandchildren. Those of you who are children or grandchildren of immigrants whose second language was English by the time they came to Canada, they wanted to play down their immigrant language. And how many of us regret the fact that we're not able to speak the language of our parents and our grandparents? In Israeli society, there was a big change. In the 80s, Ethiopian Israeli immigrants all Hebraicized their names, but today, about 5-6 years ago, Israel had its first native-born Ethiopian Israeli ambassador to Ethiopia, if you can understand. Right? She was born Ethiopian, moved as a young girl, and went to represent Israel in Ethiopia, pretty intense. And her name was Belainish Zivadia. I can't even pronounce it, but it's clearly that's her Ethiopian. That's the name that she is part of her identity. So she didn't Ari Ben Canaan her name, but she kept her tradition. And why I think that happened in 1991? I think it has to do with the immigration from the former Soviet Union. Within a decade, over 1 million Jews came from the former Soviet Union, and if you traveled around Israel today, if you traveled in Israel in the 60s and 70s, you saw signs in Hebrew, period. It's kind of like in Quebec, right? You see signs in French, period. I don't know if there's any English these days. But today, traveling around Israel, and you see lots of signs in Russian. And you hear lots of people who still go by their Russian names, because in a decade, if the society increases by 20%, of people who can't all be socialized and to be, homogenized into the exact same product, and, as I said, recognition that it's okay. If you're an immigrant from Kyiv, if you're an immigrant from St. Petersburg, it's nice that your daughter goes to ballet and that your son wants to be a classic pianist, and that's a great thing. And you should preserve your culture and you should preserve your tradition. A few other, I think, indications of that. There was a law a number of years ago where a professional Israeli soccer player, 16-year-old kid, Ben Sahar, was signed by Chelsea, one of the top English football teams, and he had a problem in that at 18 he had to go to the military. And if a young man who's potentially a world-level soccer player has to do 3 years of military service, he can say goodbye to his military career. Shachar Pe'er, world top 15 ranked tennis player years ago. She was given the opportunity to not serve in the military. And of course, you all know the most famous Israeli these days. No, not a politician. It's a she.
Gal Gadot?
See, I know, as always. Gal Gadot. Gal Gadot, Wonder Woman. The new one out yet? I don't know.
No.
Not yet. Gal Gadot, Wonder Woman, served in the IDF. She did 2 years. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, people want to boycott her movies, because, she was an occupier. But she served, whereas there was another famous Israeli, a model, who for many years was the partner of Leonardo DiCaprio. This is like the table of ring Israel. But yeah, Bar Rafaeli, who was heavily criticized in Israel because she said, listen, I'm a model and I can't put my career on hold for 2 years, so she didn't do the military. But she was allowed not to do the military. If you're an outstanding athlete, if you're an outstanding musician, outstanding dancer, you can get an exemption from Tzahal today. And that never happened a generation or two ago. What else? Just before I got here, last week they publicized the most visited archaeological sites in Israel. The first, can you guess? A national park. There are both archaeological sites, but national park. Can you guess? Masada, still the number one, but number 2 was Caesarea. Now, I find that fascinating, because Masada is the story I already shared with you. But what is Caesarea? Caesarea was a city that was the quintessential Roman capital of the land of Israel for 600 years. It was where the Bar Kokhba revolt began. And it was a place where archaeologists also found remains of a synagogue with a beautiful mosaic floor. And it's a place where, although majority culture in the land and religion in the land of Israel was pagan Roman, Jews still lived in the land of Israel, and Jews thrived in the land of Israel and created in the land of Israel at Caesarea and at Zippori and many other archaeological sites. So 2 generations ago, no question that Masada would have been light years ahead of every archaeological site national park, but today the fact that Caesarea is closer gives us hopefully a little bit more of an understanding of how Israel has gone from a very monolithic society, founded on 3.5, call it, central myths: the story of Tel Chai in 1920, the fall of Masada in 73, the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135, and I added the Maccabean revolt 3,100 years ago to try to create a new Jew. A muscular Jew has gone to a much more diverse Jewish community that is made up of many, many different parts. And the ability to focus on the individual, not just the collective, I think makes Israel a much richer society as a result. So thank you for listening. I think we have some time for some questions.
So we do have some time for some questions. Just raise your hand and Michael Conley does it all the time.
Mrs. Laughran.
I'm interested to know what's the position of the ultra-Orthodox and how they committed into Israel,
So-
especially the Haredim.
The question Lucy asked is about the ultra-Orthodox. So about 10, up to 12% of Israelis are ultra-Orthodox, Haredim, and of course they're divided into two large subgroups, and then I'm not going to go there, that's next year. But the ultra-Orthodox, back in the early years of Israel's, even before Israeli independence, who became our first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, reached an understanding with the leadership of the ultra-Orthodox community. At the time, there were about 400 men studying in yeshiva, and Ben-Gurion said, listen, the yeshiva world was destroyed in Europe in the Holocaust. We will preserve your yeshivot. We will ensure that Judaism and religious Judaism is kind of the central, all public space in Israel. So in government, the army is kosher. It's the only army in the world that's actually, well, you can get a kosher meal, probably the Canadian Armed Services, but kosher army. So all state institutions observe Shabbat and all of that. And Ben-Gurion said, we'll exempt you from military service, the 400 men studying yeshiva. He probably believed that in a generation or two at most, they would wake up and smell the hummus and drink the Turkish coffee and be just like everybody else. But it didn't work. And today there are 40 or 50,000 Israelis who are men, who are subsidized by our taxpayer shekel, and are studying in yeshivot. And it's one of the critical internal issues in Israeli society. On a bracket, because I'm not talking about this tonight, the Israeli elections. One of the reasons we keep going to elections has to do with the question of whether the ultra-Orthodox should be put into the draft or not. I believe that there's plenty of room for ultra-Orthodoxy within parameters that I think the rest of Israeli society have to define. And I think part of the reason that they're not strongly enough defined is because of the Middle Israel. What do I mean? There are about 12% ultra-Orthodox, a similar number of modern Orthodox, and then most other Israelis define themselves as secular. And so they don't really want to have that much to do with religion, and they don't want to push the boat too much. In other words, I'm not at all religious, but the only legitimate form of Jewish expression is Orthodoxy. It's changing. How do I know? Our son Tal got married in August with our Reform rabbi from Modi'in, who Rabbi Dan knows here. And I asked him before the wedding, because in Israel the only way you can get married, whether you're a Muslim or whether you're a Greek Orthodox Christian, a Roman Catholic Christian, or a Jew, is through your state religion. So even a Muslim man cannot marry a Greek Orthodox woman in Israel. They have to, one of them has to convert. And even, you might not realize this, a Greek Orthodox woman cannot marry a Catholic Arab, both of them Arab, because neither of their clergy will agree to marry them. So everything in Israel is according to those religious groupings. And there are about 1,500 weddings by the Reform movement, I think, in Israel, and a similar number by the conservative movement. That's a lot, over 3,000. And they're not legal. I don't mean to say that my son breaks the law. Well, he talks on his phone once in a while when he drives, but he shouldn't. But he and his, before the wedding, I said, so Tal, that's his name. I said, Tal, are you planning on registering with the rabbinate? What's the difference? If our rabbi has a spiritually meaningful ceremony with my son and daughter-in-law, there's no legal, the kind of is, the state looks at them as if they're common law married. But a year and a half ago, a conservative rabbi was arrested for performing a wedding. So the 3,000 couples in Israel are married in that way. And I said, are you going to register with the rabbin and get it kosher? Which would mean that my daughter-in-law would have to go to the mikveh and have to go through this crazy ceremony that has no meaning to them whatsoever. And he said, you think? We said that in Hebrew. He says, Nir halacha. And there are more and more people in Israel who are doing that. There are public buses that are for free in the area of Tel Aviv for the first time ever in Israeli history. There are many stores and restaurants that are open in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv. So the ultra-Orthodox don't have a stranglehold on life in Israel, but the ultra-Orthodox have an inordinate amount of control. And to me, it's not about their military service, it's about the responsibility of being citizens of Israeli society, studying core curriculum subjects, getting jobs, contributing to the tax base rather than just taking from it. And I hope that our elections on the 2nd of March will finally change that, because there seems to be very little daylight between the moderate left party, center-left party, the moderate center-right party, and another party of Mr. Lieberman, because they want to try to deal with that issue once and for all of the ultra-Orthodox studying and getting jobs, less about being conscripted to the military. Yes. But they are a part, and I think they should continue to be a part of Israeli society, but with less political influence. Yes?
And just to clarify, with the discuss this
Great question. Do the ultra-Orthodox buy into those myths? Absolutely not. None of them have any relevance for them. The ultra-Orthodox buy into those myths. The story of Hanukkah, for example, I would say that, sorry, I'll take that statement. I'll walk that statement. Some absolutely not, and some absolutely. So Masada is meaningless to them. I think the Bar Kokhba revolt might have some meaning to them. Tel Chai has zero meaning for them whatsoever. But definitely the story of Hanukkah, the zealousness of a minority in the Jewish world convincing the rest of the Jewish world deeply resonates with them. But it's a non-biblical holiday, so it is less significance to them than the holidays that are in the Bible. But I thank you for that question, because when I talk about the central myths of Israeli society, I'm leaving out two major groups in Israeli society, the 12% ultra-Orthodox and the 20% Arab, for whom those stories are not stories around which their youth are socialized. Yeah. Back to the gentleman with the hat. Sorry.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could respond, or how you would respond to people who compare, like modern day Israel to apartheid South Africa.
Oh, it's a question not really related to what I was talking about, but I was quite clear. I'll repeat the question. How would I respond to people who suggest that Israel is similar to apartheid South Africa? I'd say a couple of big differences. One is that apartheid was a unique model, a finite period of time where a group of Europeans came and usurped indigenous populations' land, not too dissimilar from countries like Australia, United States, Canada, perhaps. Whereas the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a conflict between what majority of both societies believe are two groups of people who have competing and challenging claims to the exact same piece of land. So you cannot at all use language to describe one particular event with another particular event. You could, however, say that there is injustice in Israeli society in that Israel does occupy certain piece of land. And maybe I'll answer the question by giving you two figures. Another book, in case I haven't given you enough to read after this session, is a book that came out 2 years ago in Hebrew and 1 year in English called Catch 67 by Micha Goodman from the Hartman Institute. And he essentially in this book says that the two core narratives of Israeli society post-67, which said that we have to give up land in order to achieve peace with the Arab neighbors, which, by the way, Israel suggested right after the war, and unfortunately was not embraced by the Arab neighbors in '67. And the second narrative of we can't give up this land for various reasons. The key, he says, is that now you know how our election system works, and I'm not going to talk about this, but if I were to tell you that 70% of Israelis believe in one thing, you'd say that can't be, Mike. But it's true. About 70% of Israelis can identify with the following two statements. Statement one is that we have to end the occupation. The occupation is not good for us, morally, ethically, theologically. We cannot occupy the West Bank, and therefore we have to leave the West Bank. But 70% of Israelis will also say, we can't leave the West Bank. Because call it the West Bank, call it Judea, Samaria, call it the liberated territories, call it the land of Israel, whatever term you want. It is suicide from a security point of view. So we can't leave the West Bank, and we can't stay in the West Bank. Now, how do you have 70% of your society identify with both of those two statements? So read his book, and definitely anybody who suggests that Israel is apartheid. There are immoralities in Israeli society, but again, I draw a clear distinction between two narratives competing. I see Shira at the back, yes.
Sort of move for more individualism led to younger Israelis actually emigrating out of Israel, and how is that? Where is that demographic coming from out of Israeli society, and what impact has that had?
Where's the demographic of
of the people who moved? Like 4 out of 5 of my first cousins moved away from Israel in the last 10 years.
And how many of them are pursuing higher academic degrees? I'm curious.
None of them.
Interesting, because the biggest departure from, and it's something that's impossible to measure. Like there are a number of Israelis in this room who are Israeli. They might have lived here for 50 years, but they're still Israeli. Now, the majority of Israelis today who are leaving Israeli society are academics. A lot of people who are just not able to find a postdoc opportunity in Israel. It's a smaller place. A lot of them are going to Europe and to North America. Whereas if you look 40 years ago, I think the emigration from Israel was very different. It was much more economic. Today you can make a lot of money in Israel. I mean, you can also lose a lot of money, but Economically, Israel is a very, very different, from a material standpoint, it's a very, very different place. So there are people leaving Israel, not huge numbers. The biggest, I think, are even more to Europe. A lot of people, all the young Israelis who want to, sing in the opera. There's one opera in Israel. There are 3 in Berlin, so it's a better place to go pursue your opera. One, two. The question, and I'm guessing that you may be moving in this direction. Has it affected the ethos of collective responsibility in Israeli society? One way I think of measuring that is through the military. There's mandatory conscription for 70% of Israelis, right? Not the Arab and not the ultra-Orthodox population. And the numbers of people volunteering for special units and the pilot courses and officers courses is definitely not dropping. The number of people who are called up in a state of emergency for reserve is not dropping as well. So you don't have that drop in motivation. The truth is, a society that's approaching 10 million people, almost 6.5 to 7 million Jews, is a different place than it was in 1973's Yom Kippur War, when there were 2.5 to 3 million people. And so it's a larger society that can afford the luxury of allowing people to pursue academic studies or pursue the arts or sports or whatever else without having to do the military. In spite of that, there's still no reduction in motivation to the military. Yes?
I'm just curious about your story. What motivated you to leave? And given the changes that you've described, has that worked well for you? And how would you feel if your kids said they wanted to move to Canada?
Well, tough question. So, how much time do I have? No. So my story. So I grew up in Vancouver. I went to Talmud Torah. I graduated Eric Camber. Did a gap year in Israel, which I highly encourage you to send your grandchildren around. No, on a kibbutz program. And I had a great time. I wasn't sure if it was because I was 18 and on the other side of the world and away from home, plug your ears, Mom. But yeah, we were all 18 at one point. It was a great experience. And then I came back and I did finish my degree at York, and I fell in love with Israel. I wanted to go back another time, so I went for a year after Tel Aviv University, after finishing at York, and I had a great time there. And then I joined a group of people who moved there together. We were 36 people in 1987-88. We're about 8 of us now. My wife was part of that group. And
so eight stayed.
8 stayed, yeah. We're still there 31 years later, and all 3 of our kids were born in Israel. And all 3 of our kids, I think, see that they have Canadian citizenship through me and American through my wife, and Israeli, of course. And they all, people always say, we're going to go study in America. And they're like, why would we spend $300,000 for an undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan when we can go to Tel Chai for significantly less than that? And they see themselves as Israeli, they see themselves as American, a little bit Canadian as well, and I don't think they're going anywhere. Could they go somewhere? Yeah. But the truth of the matter is that it takes the same amount of time to fly from here to Tel Aviv as it did 31 years ago, but the distance is a lot less because of technology, because of the price of a ticket is significantly less vis-a-vis our earning power 30 years ago, absolutely. And the world is a smaller place. It's the same size in the one end, but it's a smaller place, and I hope that they'll continue to live there. He's trying to make me feel guilty that my mother's grandchildren live on the other side of the world, but yeah. But they definitely see themselves as very
But has this transition been better for you?
I
The move
can-
away
can-
from the collective to the
from Vancouver. Has the move with the collective? Absolutely. I mean, I think that when I first made Aliyah, people always asked me the first 5 years, you're not Mike, you gotta be Mickey. You gotta be Michael. I said, no, I am Mike. And my wife is Michelle. We didn't Hebraize our names. Our kids have modern Hebrew names. And I think Israel is a much stronger society by being able to celebrate. It's what the former Chief Rabbi of England and the Commonwealth, Jonathan Sachs, wrote in his great book 20 years ago, The Dignity of Difference. We're stronger having differences amongst us than we are homogenizing society. I think ultimately it's not good to homogenize society because everybody becomes the same. And I think Israel is just, turn on the radio and Israel, you hear music that is very different than it was a generation or two ago. Walk the streets of Tel Aviv and see the food. And lots of influence, I think, are because of the increase in individuality. There was another question somewhere in the back. Yes?
You mentioned sort of parenthetically that this huge percentage of Israelis are secular. And in my experience, having been there just a few years ago, that to me was a huge definition of the new Israelis, and I was fascinated by it. And I'm just wondering where you place them. It's highly nationalistic, but it's totally secular. And to me, that's a phenomenon that defines a huge part of new Israel.
It being secular.
Yeah.
So I will answer with a question, and that is you should read a new book called Israeli Judaism, Portrait of a Cultural Revolution by Shmuel Rosner and Camille Fuchs. You might see Shmuel Rosner writes a lot in Haaretz, a lot of Israel diaspora stuff. Has he been here?
No.
But, and Camille Fuchs is the #1 pollster in Israeli society. He's overworked this past year, I don't know why. But interesting book, and in the book, they describe, they kind of divide Israel into 4 sectors. And in one sector, he is basically what we call the ultra-Orthodox. So their Judaism is expressed solely through the prism of tradition, religion. There's another group, small, and they're about 12-15%. Another group of about 10-12% who view themselves, identify themselves kind of universally as humanists. So they're, quote, secular, nothing to do with any Jewish tradition, and they're living there, but they could live in Berlin without a problem. And then there's another group of people who are, very nationalistic, but not very traditional, also about 15%, but the majority, about 55% according to their book, and he's a pollster, and he's, well, he might be right this time around, we'll see, but he's been pretty accurate in the last 2 elections, Camille Fuchs. 55% of Israelis see themselves through the prism of a combination of Jewish tradition / religious observance and being members of the Jewish people, Jewish nationalism, Zionism. And I think that's where the majority of Israelis are. So when I hear Israelis say, as a member of the Reform movement, that, we're secular, I challenge that, because they're not really secular. Because their family dinner, if it's once a week, will be on Friday night. And 90% of them will light a Chanukiah at the workplace or at home. And probably 70% will do some sort of tradition of Shabbat candles, blessing children, whatever, on Friday night. And 95% will go to Passover Seder, because there's nothing else to do, right? And nobody will drive on Yom Kippur. And they speak the language of the Bible, and they live in the land of the Bible, and they study the Bible as part of their curriculum in order to graduate high school and to get into university. So secular, in a Western terminology, doesn't work in Israel. And I think more and more Israelis are hopefully opening up to that and realizing that. And I can definitely say in the 25 plus years that we've been involved in the Reform movement, it's huge change. We used to be members of a synagogue in Jerusalem, where the majority of people, the founding fathers and mothers of that community, were all Anglo-Saxons. I'm an Anglo-Saxon, I don't know why, but English-speaking immigrants to Israel. And the community that we're in now in Modi'in is much more. It's probably 75 to 80% native Israelis. People who said, as their kids were going to nursery and kindergarten, I'm not Orthodox, but I'm not secular. I want my kids to engage in a little bit of Jewish tradition. And I think that's where the hope, if our thesis is correct, in that we have really succeeded in transitioning from a collectivist society to a more individualist society, that might be good news for the different modes of expression in Judaism. So, lots to think about.
Mike, thank you so much. Thank you all.